So thank you for all your perspectives. I think this is just so wonderful to see what brings all of us joy in medicine. So I'm actually so delighted to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Liana Lianov. Now, actually, Dr. Lianov was the past president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. Some of you may be familiar with this body that developed over a decade ago. And she currently serves as a chair of the Happiness, Science, and Positive Health Committee of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. She's a lead faculty for the ACLM, which is the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, Health Provider Well-Being Program, and the vice chair of the American Board of Lifestyle Medicine. She's the president of Positive Health and Wellness Division of the Internal Positive Psychology Association. She's actually done some work on positive thinking and published several articles, actually more recently an article in one of the journals in lifestyle medicine, which I actually happened to read last night. It was quite good. She also sponsored, and I think it was a Happiness Summit in New York. It was either earlier this year or last year with Dr. Dean Ornish and Barbara Friedrichsen, who are experts in that area. And so she's also been working on curriculum for lead faculty for training in the American College of Lifestyle and Preventive Medicine. So let me actually, please join me in welcoming Dr. Liana Lianov, who's actually a local. She lives in Sacramento. So Dr. Liana? Oh, you're right there. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm very delighted to be here, and I recognize a few faces in the audience, and a shout out to my friend Lydia Waitress, who's going to be up here in a little while, who connected me to this group. And even though I'm a local, I haven't been active in this organization, but maybe I will after today, get more organized and be able to participate. I am delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about something that I've been passionate about for my entire career, but has basically become my full-time work, mostly on a volunteer basis, for the last couple of years. And so before I dive into my talk, I think it would be good for me to share that background so you have a little context. And thank you for that wonderful introduction, Rajiv. And I think a lot of what he mentioned is important, and I'm going to put it in more of a personal story as to what led me to be up here today talking to you on this topic of positive psychology and the power of positive psychology. So for almost a couple of decades, off and on, I worked right here in Sacramento for the California Department of Healthcare Services, and doing a number of programs, and really feeling, sometimes we were making policy changes that would help people, but a lot of times it felt like I was pushing paper and I wasn't really helping a lot of people. And so, but it was my day job and doing the best I could. And my hobby was to read quote-unquote self-help books, but I was choosing them wisely and choosing books written by people who were researchers who I think knew what they were talking about, and it was just for my own pleasure. And I thought, oh, it's just a side hobby, but I kept at it year after year. And there were pieces of it that were psychology-oriented, pieces of it that were mental health services, kind of psychiatry-oriented, and pieces that are about general well-being and a healthy lifestyle. And so I was very passionate about this. And then I had the wonderful opportunity to join the American Medical Association because they'd started a brand new division of healthy lifestyles. And what they wanted to do was to figure out how to help busy physicians and practitioners help their patients to live a healthy lifestyle. We all know we need to be doing it, but it's a whole different story to change our lives and motivate ourselves and make the time and et cetera to live a healthy lifestyle. And also, well, how does a physician or any health practitioner help a patient do that? So we did a number of focus groups with family physicians and others. In fact, we even did I would sit behind a one-way mirror and observe these focus group interviews that were being conducted kind of incognito, because we didn't want the participants to know that it was the American Medical Association, because we thought that might bias their responses. And basically they'd say, yeah, sure, I learned about this in medical school, and yeah, sure, this is really important, but I don't have the time, and people can't get paid for it, for that extra time. And by the way, patients are kind of not motivated anyway, so it was kind of depressing to hear that. And so we worked very hard to figure out what kinds of tools and programs could turn that around. And so a piece of that had always been in my head it's around the positive, what you'll hear about today is the positive psychology piece, the health behavior change piece. But I just continued to work on that kind of on the side as a hobby. And a couple of years ago, I was attending in 2017, the International Positive Psychology Association conference, their World Congress in Montreal. And their keynote speaker, who was their outgoing president at the time, was Barbara Fredrickson, and I'd read a lot of her work. She's a big name in positive psychology, a researcher at University of North Carolina. And what she was talking about was healthy lifestyles. So what she was talking about is health and well-being and the kind of medicine that we'd been working on at the AMA and other places to promote. And I looked around in an audience of almost 2,000 people who were mostly psychologists, counselors, researchers, but there weren't that many physicians in the audience. And I looked around and I'm like, wow, my colleagues need to hear this. And so afterwards, I stood in a long line of a book signing, and I introduced myself, and I said, can you help me get this message out to my colleagues, to physicians, so that they can help themselves and help their patients? Because this is just so important. And she was very accessible, and it's been wonderful to work with her. And as Rajiv mentioned, what I ended up doing is under the umbrella of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, I pulled together an invitation-only summit of positive psychology researchers, healthcare innovators, and physicians of all specialties to huddle together and figure out how do we make this practical for busy practitioners. And the conclusion was, there were a number of recommendations, but the conclusion was put your own oxygen mask on first, right? So start with a physician well-being program. And in fact, that's what we did. We went back for a grant, and that is the program that we're developing now. And of course, well-being programs are mandated now in academic institutions and healthcare systems around the country. What's going to be unique about our program is it's going to focus on healthy lifestyle and focus on positive psychology, because without that, as you'll see, we can't really move forward to what I call total well-being. And I loved our presentations earlier this morning that are all relevant to those pieces, even though they didn't use the word positive psychology. Mindfulness was mentioned. Everything that we've talked about comes down to a form of what I call positive psychology interventions. So I think hopefully I will be able to now give you a little more of the science behind that and kind of pull it together for you. So anyway, what has happened is we had the summit in a couple of years, last year. So a couple of years ago, I kind of decided I was going to do something. Last year we had the summit, and then we published 2 papers. So one is in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine that talks more about the role of healthcare providers and healthcare systems in promoting these kinds of positive activities. And then the one that's going to come out this fall very soon is in Translational Behavioral Medicine, and it talks about the broader community, how there are a number of stakeholders that can help us in the healthcare system do a better job of making this available to our patients and for ourselves to promote these kinds of positive psychology activities for total well-being. And then last but not least, we're putting together something that's much more, even more practical, pushing the envelope and taking the science, the beautiful science that the positive psychology community is doing, and translating it in a way that speaks to a practitioner in a book that's going to be coming out next month at our conference, our Lifestyle Medicine Conference in Orlando. So stay tuned for that as well. So with that background, I'll pull it all together for you. And my disclosure is I am on the Solera Health Scientific Advisory Board. So what I'd like to do very briefly, we'll do a few exercises. I do want to expose you to some of the key scientific studies. We're not going to go into a bunch of boring data. I'm just going to give you the kernels, the good stuff. And I want you to be thinking about what you can implement in your own self-care and develop your own action plan. In fact, how many of you, at least if not on paper, electronically, at least in your head, have what you would call a personal well-being action plan? Raise your hand. Well, a few of you, that's good. Maybe by the end of my talk, it'll be almost 100% of you, I hope. So we're going to start out with, it's sort of on the heels of a mindfulness exercise and other exercises, is this 4-7-8 breathing. So if you want to just relax, you can close your eyes or not. One important thing, because this is focused on the breathing, is to put the tip of your tongue behind the top of your teeth and keep it there through this breathing exercise. And what you need to do is breathe in through your nose for a count of 4, hold it there for a count of 7, and then breathe out through your mouth for a count of 8. So let's do it together. Amazing what that did at the energy level in this room. It's amazing. You feel a difference? And that was just one breath that you can do for yourself anytime throughout the day to relax yourself. So positive psychology, I've been throwing that out in my general introduction. How many of you have heard of it, have read about it? Show of hands. Okay, quite a few of you, very good. So the father of positive psychology is Martin Seligman, and he's been around in this space for about 3 decades now. Probably the framework that is most useful to use is in his book called Flourish, which was published in 2011, and he uses this PERMA framework. So if you're thinking about, well, what are all the pieces that are part of positive psychology, this is the easiest way to remember it. So P for positive emotions, E for engagement, R for relationships, M for meaning and a sense of purpose, and A for a sense of accomplishment. And the key pieces there are positive emotion. We're going to talk a little more about the science behind positive emotion. And then in terms of health and longevity, particularly relationships, and we're going to talk about relationships, and having a sense of meaning and purpose. There's the most science behind those elements. So positive psychology approaches are good, of course, for managing stress. But what has always frustrated me is that when my colleagues would talk about healthy lifestyle, they would talk about, of course, the usual healthy nutrition, physical activity, sleep, and then they would avoiding risky substance use, and then they'd say stress management. Well, this is not, it certainly helps with stress management, but it's not the same thing as stress management. Stress management gets you to a baseline, and what we want to do is go above that and flourish and experience full joy of living. So we'll talk more about that. But certainly because of that goal, we can achieve not only managing stress, but what Martin Seligman called positive health. It's an attribute of health that goes well beyond what we think of as emotional health, mental health, physical health, social health, even spiritual health. It's a separate element. And it does underline our ability to self-motivate unconsciously towards healthy behaviors. It improves, of course, our psychological well-being, helps with our physical well-being, helps in our interactions with patients, so the patients are more satisfied and we're more satisfied with those interactions. So I'm sure many of you have seen various statistics around physician stress, physician burnout, so that's not what this talk is about, but just to kind of mention in passing, and this was a study of California physicians where 53% of them admitted to having severe or moderate stress. And there are many wonderful ways to manage stress, some of which we have been exposed to this morning: relaxation, breathing, mindfulness, cognitive behavioral techniques, getting social support, connecting with colleagues, and also these kinds of positive psychology interventions that I'm starting to introduce to you. The first one in that PERMA is the positive emotion or positive affect. And again, what we're trying to do is not go from being sad or stressed to neutral. We're trying to go all the way to being happy, feeling joyful, feeling a sense of flourishing. And what we know, science shows, plenty of science shows, that this kind of positive affect, positive emotion is associated with having less illness, fewer hospitalizations, fewer accidents, longer survival, greater longevity, just overall feeling of vitality, self-reported vitality, just physically feeling better. And those words, because we're feeling that, reflect that. And many people use Twitter these days, so they've done a couple studies where they followed the words that people used in their tweets. And they were able to follow them in terms of their illnesses, but in this particular case, it was around their cardiovascular disease mortality. And lo and behold, there's an association. And in fact, so Ed Diener and colleagues, if you're really interested in this area, that's a name to remember, is Ed Diener. He's got about 30 or 40,000 citations in the literature. It has been able to show that this is more powerful, this positive affect, and evaluating your life both emotionally and then cognitively, evaluating your life that you are flourishing, you feel like you're flourishing, is much more predictive of your mortality than the combination of smoking, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and other predictors. And so we were talking about CVD mortality. Here's another of Diener's studies, which is around longevity. Exercise is powerful. Of course, not smoking is powerful, but guess what? A sense of subjective well-being is even more powerful with years gained much greater than by smoking, by not smoking, and by exercising. So there are a lot of words to use, affect, to really relay positive affect. We can say joy, like what we use in the title of this summit. We can say we're calm, we're content, we're optimistic, we have a sense of gratitude or awe, a sense of love, life satisfaction, a sense of flourishing. And of course, all of these words have slightly different meanings for ourselves, and in research, it's a little bit messy. And so the positive psychology researchers are trying to tease out, are there nuances with these words, and what can we learn, and which ones should we be triggering or going after? What's interesting, though, is that there is a cultural difference of what we would consider joy and happiness in an Eastern culture versus a Western culture. Our Western culture values high arousal, high energy states. And so in the amygdala, we are triggering those high positive states, And the research, at least the early research, is showing that people, again, and we showed in those studies from the tweets, that they're living longer if they're using more of these positive, high arousal words. And interestingly enough, though, low arousal words like I'm feeling calm and peaceful, although it's great to be able to manage our stress, is not necessarily associated with longevity. So it's a very complicated science to tease out, and we have a long ways to go. And one of the sets of research around this has to do with culture, as I mentioned. And what we are able to tease out in these early studies is that in Asian cultures, there's a value system behind feeling calm rather than feeling aroused, and that equates to being joyful and happy for those cultures. I've been talking about mostly the amygdala and raw positive emotion. There's another way to study this, which is through the prefrontal cortex, where we're sort of thinking about and evaluating our life. How satisfied am I with my life? So that's a separate area of positive psychology research. And Ed Diener has developed this satisfaction with life scale. And he came and presented at our summit last year, said, well, he studied a number of questions, I think about 50 questions, and tried to validate which ones are the most predictive of how someone is going to do well. And he came down with these 5, and then he said, but if you're really busy, and in a busy practice you want to add a couple of questions, maybe in your intake, to get a sense of where your patients are at, or for yourself, the 2 in bold he highly recommended as a quick way to assess from a cognitive perspective where someone is coming from on their subjective well-being. So what are the mediating mechanisms of these emotions and self-evaluations that happier individuals have that make them live longer? We're still studying this, but there are a lot of potential mechanisms. Of course, what we're really doing is influencing our parasympathetic nervous system. So we are improving our cardiovascular health, we're lowering inflammation, we're strengthening our immune system, we have longer telomeres, better endocrine function, and healthier behaviors as associated with a feeling of happiness. Those health behaviors, of course, is exercising more, not smoking, using seatbelts, eating a healthy diet, and less alcohol, risky alcohol use. Positive affect this is the piece that I heard is so important. This is the piece that I heard Barbara Fredrickson present in that World Congress in 2017 that was a light bulb for me. This is what really got me excited, because here I'd been working in the lifestyle medicine community, and we've been trying to figure out how do we get people to change their behaviors so that they are healthier. This is the crux. How do we get them to eat healthier, to exercise more? How do we do it for ourselves? And there she was, showing her data, really excellent research, that we can boost our engagement in these healthy behaviors even in a non-conscious, unconscious way through positive emotions. So we know that coaching someone and making that action plan, you know, how many times are you going to exercise, let's build an action plan, etc., is hard work, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. People follow through or they don't. But wouldn't it be easy if we could make it even easier? And perhaps where we start is what gives someone a sense of joy, what gives you a sense of joy, a sense of happiness. Start there, boost your positive emotions, and then naturally your brain will help you to do the right thing and have a healthy lifestyle. She calls this, Barbara Fredrickson calls this the upward spiral theory. And here's another beautiful graph that she presents to us. So we have positive affect, and these all feed into each other. So you can start with maybe doing an activity that's healthy, like exercise, or maybe enjoying a beautiful plant-based meal, and that gives you joy, a sense of joy. And that feeds on itself literally and figuratively to make you want to do that more. But what's also really important is it's just not that inner circle, there's also that outer circle, which she says that it builds vantage resources. So a happier person is someone we all want to be around, for example. So they're going to get more social support. And if you get more social support, you're probably going to also tend to have healthier behaviors. Very powerful stuff. So here we go. Positive affect, non-conscious motives to health behaviors, makes you want to engage in those behaviors. It goes around and around, but also, most importantly, it builds outside resources so that you sustain those behaviors over time. So I've been making this case that we all have a duty for ourselves and our patients to do what we can to be happy, to boost our positive emotions. I also want to make the case, and there's just a few slides here, that the science shows that there's a reciprocal relationship between a healthy lifestyle, healthy behaviors, and positive emotions, right? So if we are doing healthy things, we tend to have more positive emotions. If we have positive emotions, we tend to have a greater ability or capacity to stick with healthy habits. And for every one of the main healthy habit areas, this is true. A plant-based diet. Plant-based diet can be used to treat depression, for example. But separate from treating depression and treating stress, a plant-based diet can boost those positive emotions. And this was a study with some students where when they were feeling happier, they were self-report, they were more likely to reach for the apple instead of the chocolate cake. And as they were eating more of a plant-based diet, they were also reporting being happier. And not only that, but when they were eating that plant-based diet, not only were they happier a few hours after eating that plant-based meal, but that lasted all the way into the next day. So we have that reciprocal relationship between eating a plant-based diet and positive emotions. We, of course, have that reciprocal relationship with physical activity and exercise, right? We all know that if we're out there with a great vigorous walk or our favorite other form of exercise, we're going to feel much better. And if we're feeling more energetic, we're just more likely to go back out there and do more physical activities. Same with sleep, right? If we're in a low mood, worried about something, unhappy, we're less likely to sleep well. And if we are sleeping well, we're just more likely, of course, to be in a better mood. It's a reciprocal relationship. And of course, this is common sense. We already all know this from personal experience, but the science, and there are reams of science, are starting to bring this out. So I've been talking about healthy lifestyles and their relationship with positive emotions. That's part of that PERMA framework of positive psychology. What about other kinds of activities that then we can do for ourselves or prescribe to our patients that boost positive emotions? We call them positive psychology interventions. And here's a study that was published by HENDRIKS a couple years ago, and he did a meta-analysis, a review of all the positive psychology literature where there were some kinds of activities offered to patients or study participants to boost their emotions. And there's just a list of a few of those activities that were offered to patients. Gratitude, boosting, using your character strengths, positive goal setting, optimistic thinking, positive reminiscence. And so instead of like really honing down on something that went wrong at work, why don't you pick something that went really right at work or right with a particular relationship and replay that in your mind over and over again. Savoring any positive moment, being mindful, acts of kindness. We talked about mindfulness and meditation this morning, and some of what was talked about really fits under what we would call loving kindness meditation. And in fact, that's how Barbara Fredrickson got really famous in the positive psychology world. She was able to show that loving kindness meditation meditation, which is a meditation where you're actually wishing someone else well, has greater physiologic impacts, and it just gives me goosebumps to think about that. In terms of vagal tone, heart rate variability, and all that good stuff in terms of engaging the parasympathetic nervous system. So then you say, oh wow, so here's a long list of things, okay, does it really work? What did Hendriks come up with there? And what he came up with, because you got a variety of studies, some are good, some are not so good, a lot of different interventions, people can criticize meta-analyses, but bottom line is that even by throwing everything into that big pot of soup of positive psychology interventions, there was a significant effect sized or impact of these PPIs on reported subjective psychological well-being. Again, as I mentioned, then you're thinking, oh, well, good, then I can prescribe this, I can do this, and I can also prescribe these kinds of interventions for my patients. We have to keep culture in mind. And we're still early in the research, so it's hard to know what to recommend. So that's when people have to self-select. And people have to self-select what they think might help make them happier. But one very interesting study that I'd like to share in relation to, as I was saying, the differences between Eastern and Western cultures in Asian populations had to do with a study where they did a rotating intervention. So on that list, on the Hendrik's list, there were two things. One was practicing gratitude and the other was acts of kindness. So what this study showed is that for the Westerners, if they did the gratitude practice first, followed by the act of kindness, that seemed to have a greater boost in their well-being. Whereas for the Asian cultures, it's the other way around. If they did the gratitude practice first, and then, the acts of kindness practice first, and then the gratitude practice, they got a greater boost in their well-being. And these researchers and some other researchers concluded that, this is conjecture, but the Asian cultures tend to value being somewhat independent. They value not having to rely on others for things. And so if you're expressing gratitude, it means you're kind of admitting that you had to rely on others. And so it's what's more in line with your value system is instead to offer an act of kindness. Just an example of how complicated the science is, and so that we tread lightly. This is very exciting science. This is wonderful for us to take with it and apply it as we can, but with some cautionary notes. So with that, since I promised to do some exercises, and since I don't know your cultural preferences, we're going to do an exercise together where you get to choose whether you want to do a gratitude practice or an act of kindness practice, okay? How am I doing on time, by the way? Okay. All right. So for those of you that choose to do the gratitude exercise, what I want you to do is email or text, get your phones out right now, and email or text a thank you to someone. Now, if you're really uncomfortable with that, you could just write down 3 good things that have happened to you lately in your life and that you're grateful for in your life. Now, before we get started, so that's for the gratitude exercise. For those of you that choose not to do that, you can do an act of kindness exercise, which is to pull out your phone and email or text someone and offer who you know might need some kind of assistance or benefit from some assistance, and offer that assistance now. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. I love it. I love that you guys are taking this seriously. Now, this might feel awkward, but if you do it regularly, it won't feel awkward. And there was at least one study that showed that. There's a study on everything that people reported at first going, what am I supposed to do? This feels kind of weird. And then you start to integrate this into your daily life, your work life, your personal life, and it starts to feel natural. And you start thinking from a perspective of gratitude and acts of kindness. Okay, for the sake of time, I'll move on. Is that okay for most folks? Yes? No? Head nods? Okay. I want to dedicate a couple of minutes to social connection because it is so vital in that PERMA framework. As I said, it's one of the key components. It's the R in PERMA, relationship. And there are a couple of things to think about when we think relationship that are the take-home messages for us. Well, one is that we've got the obesity crisis that's going on, but I'm sure most of you have seen the headlines that our next public health crisis has to do with social isolation. So we better take this seriously. Why is that? I'll try to answer that. Do you have some answers? Back to Barbara Fredrickson. So we are humans. We are human creatures that are wired to connect. And we've all heard of the stress response, right? The fight or flight response that we're feeling most days, sitting in the car, in traffic, at work, with a gazillion things going on. That's the sympathetic nervous system. Our friend is the parasympathetic nervous system. And what we call, or Barbara calls, tend and befriend. And our social connections and that loving kindness meditation and those acts of kindness and just even a genuine hello to anyone at any moment boosts your parasympathetic nervous system. It boosts that tend and befriend response that is healthy for us, that we are wired to need in order to be healthy in every way. Barbara Fredrickson also calls that positivity resonance, and there are a lot of physiology behind it. Oxytocin is released, as I mentioned. It improves vagal tone, increases heart rate variability. So some of the previous speakers mentioned about the need for connection or the story that the Reverend shared. I just was thinking that was all the parasympathetic where the gentleman reacted. Yeah, so it's wonderful. And when we think of social connection, we're of course thinking about love relationships. We're thinking about deep friendships, and those are important. And each of us needs at least one close friend to share. But don't forget those daily interactions, whether it's standing in the checkout, actually talking to the grocer when you're checking out, just a genuine micro moment of connection is very powerful and has those same physiologic effects. And you can have hundreds of those throughout your day, every single day. And not only are you helping yourself, you're helping the person you've connected with. And if you want to know more about that, again, look at Barbara Fredrickson's work. She's got a wonderful book that's more for the general public, but summarizes a lot of her research called Love 2.0. The most important study, though, related to social connection comes out of Harvard. It's the adult development study that's still ongoing. It's been going at least 80 years. It's a cohort where they compared the Harvard Ivy League boys to the inner city socially disadvantaged boys over time. And this was a serious study where they were not only talking to them and interviewing them over time, over these years, but actually doing physical measurements and physiologic measurements and asking about every conceivable, just about every conceivable confounding variable you can think of in terms of what is leading over all those years to these boys staying healthy, that became men, staying healthy, being happy, and how long they lived, their survival. And what this study is showing is that controlling for all those confounding variables, the single most important factor still comes down to social connection for physical health, happiness, and longevity. So ponder that. That's pretty powerful. That's why when we say the next public health crisis is social isolation, there's a real physiologic reason for that. Why it's a crisis, because we're going to have that many more people getting ill, showing up to the ER, etc. So then when we talk about social, we might think social media, right? And most of us, I think, know social media is kind of a mixed bag, right? And we need more studies to figure out what use of social media is doing to us in terms of our happiness and health. This is a cross-sectional study, which you could poke holes at because it is cross-sectional, but it did look at these young people, ages 19 to 32. And the highest quartile of social media use per week had significantly increased odds of depression compared to the lowest quartile at odds ratio of 2.74. It might be that the kind of social media use is important. So it might be that if you're actually going on there and expressing gratitude and offering help and sharing happy stories with each other, that it's helpful. But if you're on there venting and being very negative, or if you're comparing yourself that everybody else has a great life and you don't on Facebook, that's going to get you depressed. And then I do want to just do a call out. It's been mentioned, time in nature, sunshine. Whenever I give these talks, and now I've been giving these talks kind of almost around the world a little bit, and certainly around the country, somebody will stand up and say, wow, well, this is all great, but, you know, what about people that don't, you know, maybe don't have access to the Headspace app and can't do the fancy kinds of positive psychology interventions? And I say, well, they can at least go and take a deep breath out in some sunshine, get near some nature, and they'll get those benefits. In fact, there's now a whole slew of literature, and I'm sure you've heard of forest bathing, that shows the physiological benefits of being out in nature, or even having living near nature, or at least some plants, etc. So what can you as a health practitioner do? I mentioned that we had a summit last year with a bunch of recommendations. We wrote a paper. The gist of it is we start with ourselves, so it's wonderful that we've got the summit and we're sharing today. We want to start increasing the awareness of all of this wonderful positive psychology science that I've tried to introduce you to this morning with our colleagues. We might want to be able to collaborate with researchers on making this practical and evidence-based for our primary care clinics and other specialty clinics, since a lot of this research is more in behavioral health types of settings. So we're going to move from research-informed to evidence-based. We might want to figure out those terms, you know, what words should we use, joy, happiness, what should it be? And we certainly want to be able to address the cultural issues that I mentioned. But even in your daily practice with colleagues and patients, you can start with the positive, what's going well in your day today. If you end any engagement, any encounter, what was the best thing about our time together? And you can start thinking about, I say the prescription of the future, but it really should be the prescription for now, prescribing healthy lifestyles, not only the usual exercise and nutrition, but start thinking about prescribing positive psychology habits, maybe some gratitude exercise, maybe some social time. You can do this. You can help me do this by helping to educate each other, interacting in these kinds of ways with each other, prescribing these interventions, involving yourself in research if you can, or getting others who have the capacity, but nudging them in that direction, and using it for, of course, yourself. So bottom line is, This positive psychology field is just beginning to emerge as very key in what we do in healthcare for ourselves and for our patients. We have a long way to go in terms of figuring out exactly how to apply it and how to use it. But it's very exciting, and there are little things that you can do now for yourself and for your patients, and I encourage you to do that. We're out of time, but I do want to nudge you to just spend a second here, even as we transition to the next agenda item. Think about one thing you're going to do. Write it down or on a piece of paper or on your phone. One thing that you're going to do different, either more of or a brand new activity that's around any healthy lifestyle behavior, but particularly maybe a positive psychology intervention for yourself. Set yourself a date when you can check back to see how you've done with that. And I'd love to hear from you about whether that's working for you, and I'd love to hear practical suggestions about how we can make this very user-friendly for healthcare systems and our clinics and for our lives. So thank you for your attention. I'm out of time.